So we were looking at four different ways of the history of the term liberalism and of the meaning of liberalism shown in concrete historical unfolding in the light of Edmund Burke and let's say a virtual Edmund Burke. We're part four, which we left off on, which is the it's somewhat of a stretch, but I still think it is the incursion of liberalism, and in a way, it's closer to us, so it's more clear, which is the '90s in '89 plus the dissolve of the former Soviet Union under, let's say, the power of Jeffrey Sachs and the so-called quote-unquote shock treatment, although Sachs himself disavows that term when it's raised. But nonetheless, this is an extreme. So we were going through the first. So the first one was the American Revolution, which is more or less natural because Americans came out of England and sort of developed 1,000 years. Then the second one is France, or France tried to jump into the same values that Jefferson had, right? And announced the rights of man and the citizen suddenly, even though it didn't really fit their historical mold. I mean, for instance, Alan McFarland, the anthropologist, says, in contradistinction to Bruno Latour, saying that we've never been modern. The English have always been modern, which is to say, from a very early date, the English did. Alan McFarland is a guy sort of like, I mean, he's an anthropologist, but he's also sort of like the friend of Friedrich Nietzsche, Jacob Bernhardt, who started off this looking at the daily life, looking at history, how did the peasant experience his hours, and so on, looking at close. So Alan McFarland has done the same thing for English history, and what he says is from a very early date, the English upper classes sent their children away to boarding school, which created this situation where the English were all about games, and they're about a certain kind of competition, which was had on individual footing in a way, which just didn't exist any other place. So you see there's an organic unfolding of the Geschichte, or the historiality as life in this first example of America. But in France, it comes with the terror and all this, it comes as a break. In Germany, it's even worse in a way. And then you see it even in a more poisonous form, in a certain sense, in the 89-90, where a few oligarchs stole the greater bulk of the wealth of Russia and transferred it through the Cyprus banks into England, into the banking centers in London, and so on, which naturally is something, if you're a Russian, you're not going to be very happy about that. But what's on the other side of that, after that happened, after Clinton and Sachs and so on, but one must say Yeltsin went along with it. Yeltsin shelled the Duma. He killed his own Russians who were democratically and legally the lawmakers. He forced them to step down because they were voting to impeach him and to remain Russian instead of going over to Bill Clinton, what Bill Clinton wanted. So Yeltsin did that of his own free will, and he interrupted the democratic process, it should be pointed out, and then Clinton and others praised him on how great a guy he was. After opening violence in Moscow for the first time since the 1918 revolution. But okay, so we can see there's a great, and then that led to this collapse of even police authority in most of Russia, where you had basically some of the worst times that anyone's ever had on Earth. So this is the third. this is a fourth wave of the so-called liberalism on this way of looking at it. So then you can see um, how liberalism can appear very evil when it's regarded in that trajectory. Um, so there's let's look at some other views of liberalism. So Leo Strauss understands liberalism also from a metaphysical background. He says that Spinoza is the first to start the liberal project. So far as I can understand, so he said that in his introduction, which he wrote after um, a gap of like 30 years to his Spinoza book, where he says he got it wrong the first time. But so far as I can even understand him, it's actually very difficult to understand that even that introduction properly. But what he seems to say is that Spinoza, who picked up the clear and distinct notion from Descartes, but said, let's make it even more clear and distinct. What he's basically saying is that we can't have, it's metaphysically everything that can be stated must be stated in a way that's simple enough that everyone can understand it. So this is a kind of supreme leveling that goes along with liberalism. And you see that, I think, in the daily life of Americans, where there's a very strong resistance to sort of a Socratic questioning, like what do you mean by that? What's the definition? How are you defining that? How are you defining your terms? And so on. It's maybe stronger than in most countries. Um, why exactly does Spinoza stand for the beginning of liberalism for Leo Strauss? Isn't totally clear, but again, it has something to do with a leveling and with the denying of certain possibilities. One thing, of course, it does have to do with what in Spinoza's time was still necessary, which was to deny things that are roundly denied today, such as that earthquakes or lightning or messengers from the gods, or that there is a miraculous interruption in the orderly processes of nature. I mean, materialism gains a plus so far as materialism means the same thing as routine and calculable, um, rather than all these breaks which would happen in the miraculous world. If you deny the miraculous, then you do sort of present yourself in a crude way more on the materialist side. And then, of course, Spinoza has this reputation, but it's difficult actually to see. Apparently, I mean, given the evidence that Strauss changed his view after making a very great study, but after having lived 30 years in the interim, he changed his view. So there must be some difficulties in Spinoza that are not um, easily conquerable. Um, so beyond that, um, we can consider um, a third claim to decisive ground for the concept of liberalism, which is Hobbes makes the metaphysical individualism with his notion, which is tied up, um, if you regard it from the point of view of the tradition, with favoring physical force or the fear of death over two other spheres, which in other epochs were given different weight. So the two other spheres are, I mean, one is self-preservation, right? But the other is social enjoyment of some kind, and then the third is the intellectual drive in some sense. So those other factors were given different weight. Obviously, under Plato, if you think of the Phaedrus and so on, the horse winning at the mere whiff of the good, meaning that the higher power of the intellect has some serious potency to it, some prowess. But this is denied basically by liberalism. So liberalism takes the view that just we're more familiar with in if you read the London Financial Times would be the highest, probably the highest statement of it if you read that regularly, but you'll see it constantly. But the basic view, if you spell it out in a diagram in one picture, would be the view of the pyramid of ascending needs, where you put the housing on the lower part, and then you build up in the that style, that whole way of thinking, which then coincides with the idea of happiness as fundamentally about safety and economics and so forth. So, and that idea of liberalism stemming out of which that's not Hobbes's idea of liberalism, but only the beginning is, but it stems from different sort of mutations of it. But in the Hobbes idea, the point is the state should be responsible only for, like, it's like a Nozick state, right? The night watchman state. And of course, this means the core of classical liberalism rather than liberalism in the most current state. We have to do another thing where we go from classical liberalism up to the current period. But in fact, we're trying to reach that because the Zizek version of liberalism is in a way in contest with the what Dugin thinks about liberalism. And these are in some way, the Dugin position is saying this is the technological essence, therefore it's something we're supposed to overcome, the Heideggerian technological essence. Whereas Zizek doesn't accept the Heideggerian view, he still tries to say we could reach this metaphysical individualism in the form of a kind of realization of Catholicism, which would nonetheless be absolutely in coincidence with a thinking of the full development of Marxist thought, of a kind of coming full circle through the problem that in the initial setup of the classical liberalism, where you have the social contract, which says government should only be responsible for the Hobbesian things, for self-preservation. Happiness is what people can try to pursue on their own. And then Marx says, well, that doesn't really work because money is so controlling in this liberal system, as we see actually playing out in the fourth example, the Russia Jeffrey Sachs example. But money is so controlling that you don't actually have the promised Hobbesian situation where government is only taking care of the policing function and self-preservation, and the citizens are free to happiness or whatnot. Somewhat complicated by the fact that we have these different regimes of understanding of this that have mutated from it, such as sort of, let's say, for instance, one would be a kind of Andrew Jackson and Rupert Murdoch kind of version of liberalism, where you say all the time, we want this merciless competition, the dog-eat-dog world, we like that. Just make sure that government doesn't get too big and stop the possibility of competition. And then it's sort of, they point to something like the robber barons or something like that. So you have that kind of idea of what classical liberalism is, which then misunderstands Marx as being the ones that are trying to put a stop to the so-called free competition, or whatever you want to call it, where competition is sort of a funny concept, because you think of sports when you think of competition. It's not immediately clear how to state what they mean by competition there, but part of it being entrepreneurship, but then there's a certain set of skills that goes with being an entrepreneur. And on the high end, Philip Green or somebody who's really got shot up that scale, and then people that think that they like that kind of life, then they produce this notion that the government takeover with monopolies, with a trust, could put a stop to that way of life. So there's that notion. So what I'm saying is, here we get sort of more into the current discussion, especially in America, where you have total uselessness of these terms because they overlap